At his own son's promotion party, in a ballroom full of 80 guests, a 68-year-old man was handed a folder and told, in front of everyone, to sign away his entire life's work. What almost nobody in that room understood, in that moment, was who he actually was. And by the end of the night, every single one of them would find out. This is the story of what happens when a family spends decades building something extraordinary on a foundation of silence, and what it costs when that silence finally breaks. Before we get into it, I want to say something. If this story pulls you in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country. Let's go back to the beginning. The man at the center of this story is named Cormarmac Strand. He's 68 years old, and on the morning this story really begins, November 14th, he was already awake at 2:30, lying in the dark, listening to snow tick against his bedroom window in that particular way it does, when the flakes are still small and the real weight of the storm hasn't arrived yet. He knew what was coming. He'd lived through enough Colorado winters to read a storm the way other people read a headline. By the time he pulled on his work pants and laced his boots at the kitchen table, the porch light was catching a clean 4 inches on the front steps, with more falling steadily out of a black, star-swallowed sky. His destination that morning, like almost every morning for the past several decades, was Coldwater Ridge Lodge, a resort that sits at the base of the San Juan Mountains. His father picked this land back when absolutely nobody wanted it. Cormarmac built everything standing on it today. The parking lot was empty when he pulled in that morning, the snow undisturbed, a blank page waiting to be written on. "Morning, Cormarmac. Cormarmac, we have de scientist de special." Frank Odell was already there. Frank was always already there. In 22 years of working together, Cormarmac had never once beaten the man to the parking lot, no matter how early he arrived. They worked the front walk first. Derek didn't look toward the maintenance lot. He hadn't looked in that direction in longer than his father wanted to count. "That the new general manager, Cormarmac?" Frank asked, his voice carefully flat. The tone of a man who already suspected the answer was complicated and didn't want to press on a bruise by accident. "That's my son," Cormarmac said. Frank didn't answer that. He just pushed another shovel of snow off the path and watched it settle into the drift along the fence line. "Big party tonight," Frank said finally. "Is promotion celebration." Cormarmac turned back to the drainage channel. 80 guests, full dinner service. Frank made a small sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a word, more like the sound a man makes when he's decided not to say the thing he's thinking. "You going?" Frank asked. Cormarmac Strand. Maintenance staff. Frank read it. A muscle moved once in his jaw, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "I'll be there," Cormarmac said, tucking the card back into his coat. "Go ahead and make sure the sound system in the ballroom gets tested before 5. Full check. And tell whoever's running the board tonight, do not turn off the recording function, not for any reason." Frank looked at him for a long moment, wearing an expression he'd used on Cormarmac, maybe a dozen times across 22 years. The look of a man who understood there was a great deal more behind the instruction than had actually been said out loud, and who had decided, once again, not to ask for the rest of it. "All right," Frank said, and that was the end of it. They finished the north drainage channel and moved on to the guest cabin loop as the sky slowly turned gray at its edges over the peaks. He had built every single foot of what stood around him with his own 2 hands, or the hands of people he trusted. That envelope sat in his coat pocket for 16 hours before he got home that evening, and he still hadn't decided what he was going to do about the party. He hung his coat by the door, pulled his boots off, and found his wife Vera sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, gone cold in front of her, untouched, forgotten, the same way his coffee had gone cold that morning. Drinks go cold like that when your mind has wandered somewhere else entirely and simply never came back for them. She looked up when he walked in, and her eyes went straight to his coat pocket, the way a woman's eyes go when she already knows exactly what's tucked inside it. "They sent you a card," she said. It wasn't a question. "Maintenance staff," he said. Vera set her teacup down with a small, careful click and pressed her lips together. Both her hands went flat and still on the table. After 39 years of marriage, Cormarmac knew precisely what that particular stillness meant. It meant she was silently choosing between 3 or 4 different things she could say, and hadn't landed on any of them yet. "Sit down, Cormarmac," she said. He sat. "Tell me about August," Vera said. He looked at her. "I know what you've told me over 39 years, she said, which is not the same thing. Her eyes were steady on his brown, darker at the center, the same eyes that had looked back at him across a diner booth in the spring of 1985 when she was 22 and he was 28, and neither one of them had the faintest idea what the next 4 decades were going to demand of them. He put his hands around hers on the table. "All right," he said, "from the beginning." His father, August Strand, arrived in Telluride in the winter of 1973 with $400, a used pickup truck, and no particular reason to stop there except that his truck needed a new alternator, and the mechanic on Main Street happened to be the first honest-looking face he'd come across in 3 states of driving. "How much?" Vera asked. $4,200, Cormarmac said. He borrowed the last $800 from the mechanic, paid it back in 2 months. Cormarmac was born 4 years later. He grew up understanding that his family owned land, the same way other families carry a last name, not because it had ever been handed to them, but because his father had looked at something the rest of the world had walked right past, and understood exactly what it could someday become. August put a shovel in his son's hands when the boy was 7 years old. When Cormarmac was 16, his father took him up to the ridge on a frozen January morning, the ground locked solid under a foot of fresh snow, and swept his arm across the whole raw landscape. "What do you see?" August asked. Cormarmac squinted at it. "That's right," his father said, nodding slowly, like his son had said something genuinely sharp instead of something obvious. "Anybody drives past this road, looks up here, they see nothing. That's exactly why we're safe. The day this place looks like something, that's the day people start making calculations about it. You understand?" He didn't understand. "I understand now," Cormarmac told Vera, decades later, at that same kitchen table. She squeezed his hands. "Keep going." He left his son the land, the lodge, which by then had grown to 12 cabins and 40 employees, and the operating company he'd quietly incorporated 6 years earlier under the name Strand Mountain Holdings. He left the incorporation paperwork with an attorney named Hollis Vane, who'd been handling the family's legal affairs since 1991. And he left one more thing. "I still have it," Vera said, 21 years later, at that same kitchen table. Cormarmac looked at her. "I never opened it," she said, her voice dropping half a register, the way it did whenever something cost her something to say out loud. 21 years, Cormarmac. It's in the drawer by the bed. I look at it sometimes. I always thought you would tell the children first. I thought I'd open it after that, after you finally told them." The words landed in the kitchen and sat there, heavy, between two people who had spent nearly 4 decades building an entire life together without ever quite finishing this one conversation. He looked down at his wife's hands under his, the fine lines across her knuckles, the way her left thumb pressed gently into his palm. "I know," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an accusation, really. It was simply the word that meant they had finally run out of road to kick this particular can down. Outside the kitchen window, the snow had started falling again, soft and steady, covering the driveway, covering the yard, covering everything his father had once looked at on a bare ridge in 1974, and understood in a way nobody else around him ever could. He'd been putting this off for a very long time. The first time he truly understood what money does to a person, not to the person who has it, but to the person who finds out about it. He was 32 years old, sitting in a bar on Colorado Avenue with an old friend named Russell Keene. He and Russell had grown up together in Telluride, same school, same pickup football games in the dirt lot behind the hardware store, the same questionable judgment that tends to define a person's early 20s. Russell was the kind of friend you trust without ever really thinking about it, the way you trust a road you've driven 1,000 times without once considering whether it might have changed underneath you. That night, Cormarmac told him the truth. His father had been gone 3 years by then. The resort was running, growing, finally starting to become something real and substantial. He had a company worth more than either of them had ever imagined back when they were throwing footballs around in the dirt as teenagers. "Cormarmac," Russell said, raising his glass. "That is something else." 1 month later, Russell walked into what had been August's study, and was now Cormarmac's, and sat down across the desk with a single folded piece of paper. "I want to buy the north parcel," Russell said. "I've got a developer out of Durango interested. We split the profit." Cormarmac stared at him. "August already told me he'd consider it," Russell said. His father had been dead for 3 years at that point. He had never said any such thing to anyone, and Cormarmac knew that fact the same way he knew the exact drainage patterns on the east slope or the load-bearing weight of the main lodge roof. He simply knew it without needing to think about it for even a second. He picked up the paper, unfolded it, read the number Russell was offering for land worth roughly 4 times that. "Get out of my office, Russell," he said, "and don't come back." Something complicated moved across Russell's face. Then he stood, took his paper, and walked out. Cormarmac never spoke to him again. He sat in that study for a long while afterward, his chest hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with 32 years spent believing he'd genuinely known who Russell Keene was. He told himself, for decades, that he was protecting his children from that particular kind of change. "You were protecting yourself," he said out loud, alone in the empty kitchen more than 3 decades later. His own voice startled him in the silence. He poured the cold coffee down the sink. He had made Vera a promise the winter Derek turned 25. They'd been sitting on the porch in the cold, watching snow drift down over the ridge, and he told her, "When Derek turns 30, I'll sit him down and tell him everything. August, the land, the company, all of the numbers." Derek turned 30. The one real thing he had done in all that time was pay for his son's education. Derek was accepted into the MIA program at the University of Denver back in 2009. "Dad," he said. "Dad, I got in." "Good," Cormarmac told him. "I'm proud of you, son." He hung up the phone, walked out the back door, and stood alone in the yard in February cold with the mountains going dark above the tree line, and let the feeling rise up through his chest until his eyes burned and his shoulders shook. He never asked. Cormarmac told himself at the time that this was humility on his son's part. The snow kept falling outside the window. Somewhere up the ridge, Coldwater Ridge Lodge sat dark and silent, waiting for the following evening the way a stage waits before the curtain finally goes up. Cormarmac rinsed his cup, turned off the light, and climbed the stairs to lie awake beside his sleeping wife, thinking about every single road he had chosen, year after year, not to take. The person who had let Russell Keene get close enough to see the full picture all those years ago, that had been him. He'd told himself for 36 years that he'd never make that particular mistake again, never let the wrong person get close enough to understand what he actually had. What he had never once accounted for was the possibility that the door might get opened from the inside, by someone he loved, someone who had absolutely no idea what he was letting in. Derek called on a Wednesday in October, 4.5 years before the party. "Dad, I want to bring someone home for Thanksgiving," he said. "Her name is Lacey. Her family's from Denver. I think you're going to like her." Vera looked over at Cormarmac from across the kitchen when he got off the phone. Her eyebrows lifted a 1/4 inch. "He sounds like himself," she said, "the old version." "He does," Cormarmac agreed. Thanksgiving that year was unusually warm for November. The snow held off. The sky was that hard, bright blue that follows a cold front once it's fully moved through. Lacey was 32, blonde, carrying the particular kind of polish that doesn't come from beauty school so much as from being raised in a household where presentation itself was treated as a form of respect. Vera noticed it too. Cormarmac could tell by the half-second too deliberate way she set down the dish towel she was holding. Lacey's parents arrived the following morning. Her father, Garrett Puit, pulled up in a Cadillac Escalade with Colorado plates and stepped out wearing a vest over a flannel shirt, in that particular way certain men dress when they're aiming for casual and can't quite land it. "Garrett Puit," he said, gripping Cormarmac's hand. "Great to finally meet you, Cormarmac. Derek talks about you." Something moved across his face when he said the name. Just a fraction of a shift. Nain Puit came around the passenger side with a warm smile and a casserole dish wrapped in foil. The kind of woman who arrives at a stranger's house for the first time and immediately offers to help in the kitchen. Dinner was good. Derek was more relaxed than his father had seen him in years, shoulders down, laughing easily, reaching across the table to pour Lassie's water without being asked. Garrett asked about the resort 3 separate times over the course of the evening. Never bluntly, always smoothly, the way a man does when he's making conversation and gathering information simultaneously, without letting either purpose show too clearly. "You've worked out at Coldwater Ridge a long time, Cormarmac?" "First time." "Beautiful property up there." "You know the ownership group at all?" "Second time." "Derek tells me you've been in maintenance operations out there for years. Must know every inch of the place." "Third time." Each time, Cormarmac answered simply, "Yes, a long time." After dinner, Derek and Garrett took their coffee out to the front porch. "Dad," Nora said quietly, "Garrett asked me 3 questions about you tonight," she said. "Specifically about you. Not about the family, just you." She wrapped both hands around her mug, her knuckles going white. Cormarmac looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's instincts, and in 33 years, she had never once been meaningfully wrong about a person. "I'll keep an eye on it," he told her. Nora made a small sound that suggested she'd already moved past keeping an eye on it and was mentally on to the next stage of concern. But she let it go for the moment. Later that night, after the Puits had returned to their hotel and Derek was asleep in his old bedroom, Vera found her husband in the kitchen. "Garrett Puit looked at this house," she said, sitting down across from him, "the way a man looks at something he's figuring out how to acquire." Cormarmac's chest tightened in the particular way it does when you hear, spoken out loud, the exact thing you'd only been thinking privately. "I know," he said. "He knows who you are, Cormarmac." Her voice was quiet and certain. "I don't know how, but he knows." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the season's first snow had started. Soft, tentative flakes that vanished the instant they touched the still warm ground. "I'll call Hollis tomorrow." Vera nodded once and went up to bed. Cormarmac stayed at the table, watching the snow that wasn't yet sticking, thinking about the exact look on Garrett Puit's face the first time he'd said his own name out loud. That settling, that quiet confirmation. Hollis Vane called the Monday after Thanksgiving. "I did some checking on Garrett Puit," he said. Cormarmac thanked him, hung up, and stood in his office looking out at the mountains for a long time. Then he did nothing, because Derek was happier than his father had seen him in years, and Cormarmac told himself that happiness deserved a fair chance to prove itself before he brought a lawyer into the middle of it. That was the first mistake of that particular season. It would not be the last one. They ate together, the four of them. After dinner, Derek and his father ended up on the back porch in the cold, the way they sometimes did. The sky had cleared and the stars over the San Juans were the kind that make you feel genuinely small, in a way that isn't entirely unpleasant. "Dad," Derek said, "I want you to know something. I want you to be able to rest. You've worked your whole life, and I think it's time you took it easier." Cormarmac's chest pulled tight. He looked at his son's profile against the dark sky, the line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. Things he'd watched change since Derek was 8 years old. "I'm fine, son," he said. "I know you're fine." Cormarmac looked at him for a moment. "I know," Cormarmac said. "Thank you, Derek." They went inside. That was the last genuinely uncomplicated conversation the two of them would have for a very long time. After the holiday, before she drove back to Durango, Nora pulled her father aside in the driveway. "Dad, I need to tell you something Derek said to me 2 years ago." Her jaw was tight the way it gets when something has been sitting in a person's chest for too long. "We were at a bar in Denver. He'd had a few drinks. He looked at me and said," she stopped, pressed her lips together, then kept going. Something dropped through the center of Cormarmac's chest. "I told him that was ridiculous," Nora said, her voice rough at the edges. "I told him you didn't think that, but he wasn't listening. He just kept saying you always looked at him differently." She pulled one hand out of her pocket and pressed it flat against her chest like she was trying to physically hold something in. Cormarmac stood in the driveway long after Nora's taillights disappeared around the bend. The cold came through his jacket and pressed against his ribs, and he let it. His son had spent years quietly believing his father loved him less because he wouldn't pick up a shovel, and Cormarmac had never once said a word to correct it. That Christmas, Paige drove up from Denver. "Dad," Paige said, scrubbing a pot without looking up, "can I ask you something weird?" "Go ahead." "Go ahead." "Do you have something you're not telling us?" She glanced over, then back down at the pot. "Not like a health thing, just something. I've had this feeling for a while, like there's a room in the house I've never been allowed into." His throat tightened. He turned off the tap. "Paige, you don't have to tell me," she said, setting the pot in the rack, drying her hands on the dish towel, finally looking at him straight on. Her eyes were her mother's, steady, and a little too perceptive to fully avoid. "I just wanted you to know that I noticed. I'm just an old man who likes shoveling snow," he said. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Cormarmac stood at the sink with the dish towel in his hands, thinking about the room his youngest daughter had described, the one nobody had ever been allowed into. He had built the walls of that room himself, 1 year at a time, one unanswered question at a time. "Cormarmac," he said, "I need you to come to my office, not the phone, in person." Cormarmac drove down the following morning. Hollis had been his attorney for 33 years by then, 61, lean, gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who'd long ago learned that real urgency is best expressed through clarity rather than speed. "Somebody has been conducting a quiet investigation into the ownership structure of Strand Mountain Holdings," Hollis said. Not a government inquiry, private, hired research, public record searches, some attempts to access filings through back channels. He tapped the top page. It traces back to a law firm in Denver. The firm has Garrett Puit as a client. Cormarmac's jaw tightened. He'd been waiting for something like this. He simply hadn't expected it to be this organized. How long? He asked. Based on what I can establish. 8 months, possibly longer. The room was very quiet. Outside, the last of the winter snow was melting off the roof in slow drips. He's had it ready for 8 months, Cormarmac said. At minimum, Hollis said. This wasn't an impulse. This was a plan with a timeline. Cormarmac leaned back in his chair, thinking about Garrett at his Thanksgiving table 4 years earlier, asking his 3 careful questions. The settling in his face the first time he heard the name Cormarmac, the way he'd looked at the house. He had known exactly who he was from the beginning, and for 4 years he'd been quietly building toward this. There's more, Hollis said, pulling out a second page. Puit has been in contact with a real estate investment group out of Denver, Meridian Property Group. He's provided them with operational data on Coldwater Ridge, occupancy rates, revenue figures, infrastructure assessments. Hollis looked at him steadily. He's trying to sell my resort, Cormarmac said. He signed a preliminary letter of intent with Meridian 6 weeks ago, Hollis said. Under Colorado law, that constitutes a breach of his fiduciary duty as general manager. He has a legal obligation of loyalty to Strand Mountain Holdings, not to himself. Cormarmac sat with all of it for a moment. 8 months. A drafted document with his name already on it. A letter of intent with a Denver investment group. Garrett Puit hadn't simply been planning to take what he'd built. He'd been planning to sell it out from under him before Cormarmac ever even got the chance to say no. What do you want to do? Hollis asked. I want to wait, Cormarmac said. Hollis's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Cormarmac, I know what you're going to say. You have grounds to terminate his contract today. You have grounds to pursue civil action. You do not need to wait on anything. I need to know where Derek is in this, Cormarmac said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. I need to know if my son walked into this with his eyes open, or if Garrett walked him in with the lights off. Hollis held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. I'll keep monitoring. The moment this moves toward action, you call me, day or night. He paused. Hollis read it, looked up. Garrett never knew about the 2019 offer, Cormarmac said. If he had, he would have understood something important. He picked the notebook back up and returned it to his coat. This was never going to be for sale, not to Meridian, not to anyone. He stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the March cold. Behind him, he heard Hollis pick up his phone. 3 weeks after Cormarmac walked out of Hollis's office, Derek called on a Tuesday morning while his father was replacing a broken gate latch on the east cabin loop. Dad. His son's voice hit him like a door opening onto a warm room. Dad, I have news, big news. Tell me, Cormarmac said. Garrett offered me the general manager position at Coldwater Ridge. The words came tumbling out fast, on top of each other, the way they used to when Derek was a kid reporting something he could barely believe himself. Cormarmac stood in the snow with a broken gate latch at his feet and let his son's happiness travel through the phone and into his chest, where it settled in beside everything else he was already carrying. That's a big job, he said. I know it is. But Garrett says I'm ready. He's been watching how I handle things for 2 years, and he says I have the instincts for it. I'm glad you called, Cormarmac said. Are you proud of me, Dad? The question landed with the full weight of 40 years behind it. The boy asking it on the phone was the exact same boy who'd once stood in the snow at 8 years old, his hands going white with cold, refusing to go inside. I'm always proud of you, Cormarmac said. Always have been. Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and got off the phone shortly after. Cormarmac stood there holding his cell phone in the cold for a long moment. Then he pulled his glove back on and picked up the gate latch. Give him a real opportunity, he told Garrett on that call. Garrett had agreed without a moment's hesitation. Of course he had. Cormarmac was his employer. He couldn't have said no even if he'd wanted to. What Cormarmac hadn't understood back then was that Garrett had already been quietly planning to use Derek as the instrument of his entire scheme. He finished the gate latch and walked back to the maintenance shed, where Frank was sharpening a blade, the metallic scrape of it filling the small space. Derek got the GM position. Frank set the blade down and looked at him. Garrett offered it? Yes. Don't new to me. Frank's mouth pressed into a flat line. You going to tell Derek? Not yet. Frank picked the blade back up and returned to sharpening it. You know how this ends if you wait too long, he said. I know, Cormarmac said. The day Derek officially started as general manager, Cormarmac drove to the resort at 7 in the morning, the way he did every single morning. Parked in the maintenance lot, grabbed his shovel, worked the front walk, the east path, the drainage channel. At 9, a black sub pulled into the main guest lot. Derek stepped out in a new coat, charcoal gray wool, the kind that cost more than his father spent on clothes in an entire year. That afternoon, Lacey came for a tour. Derek walked her through the main lodge, the restaurant, the event ballroom. Cormarmac was replacing a supply line fitting in the utility corridor when they passed the open doorway. Derek looked in. His eyes met his father's for just a fraction of a second. Then he looked away. That's my dad, he said. Lacey's pace didn't slow. Cormarmac turned back to the supply line. His hands were steady. That evening, Owen called from Portland to congratulate his brother. Then he called his father. Hey, Dad. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was managing something. I heard about Derek. That's great for him. It is, Cormarmac said. A pause. Dad, can I ask you something? Go ahead. 3 years ago, I applied for an operations coordinator position at Coldwater Ridge. I never heard back, not even a rejection. Another pause. Did you know about that? Cormarmac's throat tightened so fast it nearly hurt. I heard about it after the fact, he said carefully. I'm sorry, Owen. That should not have happened. Owen was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said finally in the tone that means it is not actually okay, but that he decided not to push it any further. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. Cormarmac sat in his truck in the driveway for a long time after that call ended. The mountains had gone dark. The resort's lights were visible up on the ridge, warm and gold against the sky. One of his sons was managing a property he didn't know belonged to his father. He sat there in the dark and understood all at once that the thing he'd built to protect his children had somehow spent years quietly protecting them from each other instead. He didn't go upstairs until 11:30 that night. The house was quiet, the particular way a November night in Telluride goes quiet. The snow stopped, the cold fully settled in, nothing moving outside, not even wind. He hung his coat, pulled off his boots, started for the stairs. The kitchen light was on. The envelope was open. Cormarmac stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his wife. You opened it, he said. 21 years, Cormarmac. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that had been carried a long distance. He came to the table and sat down across from her. She slid the envelope toward him. He reached in and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. Vera, you are the one who keeps that family standing straight. I have watched you do it for 19 years, and I want you to know that I see it, even when Cormarmac does not say so. He loves you in the way that men like us love, which is completely and mostly silently, which is a failing I am sorry to pass on to my son. There is one thing I need you to do for me, when the time comes, and you will know when. Cormarmac set the letter down. The kitchen felt very small and very warm. He knew you, he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. He knew both of us. All right. Did you know about what Garrett has been doing before tonight? He looked at his wife's face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her mouth was set. Since March, he said. Something moved across her face. Not anger, something more complicated than anger. A kind of exhausted recognition. 8 months, she said. I needed to know if Derek. I know why you waited, she said, cutting in, pressing her hand down harder over his. Cormarmac. The truth of that hit him squarely in the sternum. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. She pulled her hand back and folded both of hers on the table. So tomorrow, you are going to walk into that room, and you are going to be every inch of what August built and what you built on top of it. Cormarmac looked at his wife for a long moment. 39 years. The diner booth in 1985. Every winter since. Hollis is in town, he said. He's been waiting in the parking lot since 6 this evening. Vera's chin lifted a fraction. Good. I told Frank to keep the sound system running, full record. Good. I'm not going to sign anything. I know you're not. She stood, picked up the letter, and folded it carefully back into the envelope, the way you return something precious to its rightful place. Come to bed, Cormarmac. He watched her move toward the hallway. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. He would have been proud of you, she said. August, not for what you built, for the fact that you still go out every morning and do the work yourself. She went upstairs. Cormarmac sat alone at the table for a few more minutes, hands flat on the wood, looking at the place where the envelope had been sitting. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went up after her. He did not sleep. At 4, he got up. He dressed in the dark work pants, thermal shirt, the heavy flannel he'd owned so long the cuffs had frayed at the edges. He stepped outside. The cold hit him the way it always does in Telluride in November, not gradually but all at once, like stepping straight into cold water. He started at the top of the walk and worked his way down toward the road. Push, lift, redirect, the same motion his father had taught him when he was 7 years old, standing in the same cold, in the same dark, on land his father was only just beginning to understand, would someday become something extraordinary. In the quiet, he heard his father's voice the way he sometimes still did, on the coldest, darkest mornings when nobody else was around. He stopped moving for a moment, just stood there in the dark with the shovel handle in both hands, the cold pressing against his face, letting the memory of that voice be as real as it was ever going to get again. Derek had never properly learned to shovel. He pushed straight ahead the way people do when nobody's shown them the right way, and the snow fought back against them every time, and he'd get frustrated and quit. Cormarmac had tried to teach him once, when he was maybe 12, and Derek had looked at him with that particular expression 12-year-olds use when they've already decided a lesson isn't worth the effort of finishing. He was finishing the back steps when the kitchen light came on. A minute later, the back door opened, and Vera came out in her heavy coat and the wool hat with ear flaps she'd owned since the early 90s and refused to replace because, in her words, it still worked fine. I was wrong to wait, he said. His breath made a cloud in the cold air. Not just these 8 months, all of it. Derek should have known who he was walking into that resort to manage. He should have known years ago. Yes, Vera said. She didn't soften it. She never did. If I had told him, he started, then stopped, and started again. If I had sat him down when I promised I would, when he was 30, none of this would have been possible. Garrett would have had nothing to work with. Maybe, Vera said. Or maybe Derek would have found a different way to become who he's been becoming. You don't know. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Cormarmac looked at the dark shapes of the mountains against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. I know you're not. She turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the light spilling from the kitchen window. Vera reached over and put her free hand on his arm, resting it there. Heavy, warm. You might lose it, she said quietly. That version might already be gone. But tonight is where you find out what's left, and whatever's left, that's what you work with. They finished their coffee and went inside. He showered and dressed in the clothes he'd laid out the night before. Not a suit he owned so much as a suit that still barely fit him. Dark slacks, a button shirt, the good boots he kept for formal occasions. Vera straightened his collar in the hallway mirror. Ready? She said. He reached into his coat pocket. Yes, he said. He held the back door for her. They walked to the truck together through the snow he'd cleared in the dark before dawn, leaving 2 sets of footprints across the fresh white surface. The drive to Coldwater Ridge took 11 minutes. He'd driven it 10,000 times before. Tonight, it felt like the first time and the last time, pressed together into the same 11 minutes. He sat there for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he got out of the truck and walked toward the light. Vera took his arm as they crossed the entrance. The room was already 3/4 full, 80 guests in their good clothes, moving between tables in the low, steady hum of a crowd that already senses it's about to witness something important. The lighting was warm and low, the chandelier dimmed to that flattering gold that makes everyone look their best and softens the slight wear in the carpet near the east wall. Their seats were at a table near the back. He noted this without any visible reaction and pulled out Vera's chair. Maintenance staff gets the back row, she said under her breath, sitting down. Best view in the house, he said. Frank O'Dell was already there, 3 tables over, in a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed within the hour. He caught Cormarmac's eye across the room and gave him the smallest possible nod. At the table nearest the stage, a young man in his early 30s had a camera bag at his feet. Garrett himself worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his entire career making other people feel, briefly, like they were the most important person in whatever space he happened to be occupying. Handshakes, shoulder grips, an easy laugh deployed at exactly the right intervals. He moved through the crowd, and the crowd moved around him, and if you didn't already know better, you would have assumed he owned the entire place. Derek stood near the front of the room with Lacey at his side, receiving congratulations with the slightly overwhelmed brightness of a man who hadn't fully processed yet that this was actually happening. "He looks like himself tonight. The good version," Cormarmac said, the same word she'd used 4 years earlier. Then Lacey leaned up and said something in Derek's ear, and his posture straightened slightly, and the brightness in his face shifted into something more managed, more performed, and the boy was gone again behind the general manager. Paige appeared at his elbow from somewhere. She'd driven up from Denver and looked like she'd come straight from work. Professional clothes, hair still neat, but her eyes moving across the room with the same alert attention she'd clearly inherited from her mother. "Dad," she said, leaning close, "I don't like the way Garrett keeps looking at you." "I know. He keeps looking over here and then looking away too fast." She pressed her lips together, "like he's checking on something." "He is," Cormarmac said, which Paige looked at him for a moment with her mother's perceptive eyes. "You're ready for whatever tonight is, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't entirely a question. "Have you talked to your brother lately?" he asked her. Her expression shifted, something complicated moving across it. Grief and frustration pressed together. "I know," Cormarmac said. Nora arrived 5 minutes later and took the seat on Vera's other side. She reached across her mother and squeezed her father's hand once, hard, deliberate, and said nothing else. Garrett Puit took the stage at 7 o'clock precisely. The room settled the way rooms settle for a person who commands them. Cormarmac watched 80 people give the man their full attention and thought about the first time Garrett had sat at his Thanksgiving table and asked his 3 careful questions, looking at his house like a number he was quietly running. "Good evening," Garrett said into the microphone, and his voice filled the ballroom as though he'd been speaking in it his entire life. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate a remarkable young man and a new chapter for Coldwater Ridge Lodge." He paused, smiled. Cormarmac reached into his coat pocket, felt the worn cover of August's notebook beneath his fingertips. Then he picked up the dinner menu and began, calmly, to read it. The second toast was to Derek. His vision, his instincts, his readiness. Garrett found him between the salad course and the entree. Cormarmac had watched him working his way over for a full 10 minutes, stopping at tables, making conversation, redirecting the way a man moves through a crowd when he wants to arrive somewhere without appearing to have intended it the entire time. He was good. He sat down in the empty chair beside Cormarmac with the ease of a man dropping in for a friendly word. "Cormarmac," he said, setting a leather folder on the table between them. "It is," Cormarmac said. "I wanted to talk to you about something small." Jointly, not just Derek, Lacey too. He set the folder down on the table and looked at Garrett. "I need to read this more carefully," he said. Garrett's smile didn't waver. "Of course, take your time." He moved away toward another table, easy and unhurried. Vera leaned close. "What is it?" "Everything," he said quietly. "The whole company, to Derek and Lacey jointly." He turned the folder so she could see the page. "Prepared months ago, my name already on it." Her breath came out slow and controlled. She looked at the page for a long moment, then at him. He closed the folder. Cormarmac's heart didn't race. It dropped, slowly and heavily, the way something drops when you already know it's falling, and you've already accepted it. Owen saw him coming. He put his fork down and straightened in his chair. Nora's hand went still on her wineglass. Paige looked at her father, then at her brother, and her face went very careful. Derek stopped at the edge of the table. He stood there a moment, looking down at his father with an expression Cormarmac had never before seen on his son's face, something caught between determination and discomfort. "Dad." He pulled the folder from in front of his father and opened it to the signature page, holding it up. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright with something that wasn't happiness. "Sign it, Dad." His voice rose another register, and the tables around them went quiet. "You've been a burden long enough. We're grown. We don't need a maintenance man following us around." His voice cracked on the last words, and he covered it with volume. "Sign it. You're nothing but a parasite. You always have been." The word landed in the room like a physical object. Parasite. The music from the speakers continued for exactly 3 more seconds. Then someone near the sound system must have noticed, because it faded out and the room went absolutely silent. The particular silence rooms fall into when something has happened that cannot be taken back. Cormarmac looked at his son standing over him, finger pressed to a signature line, face flushed, hand still unsteady. and he felt something move through him that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something older than either one of those feelings. He looked at the folder. Then he looked up at Derek and reached for it. His hand closed around the folder, not the pen. The folder. Transfer agreement, he read, entered into by Cormarmac J. Strand, hereafter the transferring party, and Derek Allen Strand and Lacey Ann Strand, hereafter the receiving parties. He looked up. That's me, he said to the room. The transferring party, everything I own, signed over tonight. Derek's flush had deepened. Garrett had appeared at the edge of the table, standing slightly behind Derek's right shoulder. Then the chair beside Garrett scraped back hard against the floor. Vera stood. Derek Allen Strand, she said. You will look at me right now. Derek turned. His face, meeting his mother's eyes, lost some of its certainty, the way a flame loses height in a draft. You called your father a parasite, Vera said, in front of 80 people in a building he owns. Her voice didn't shake. It was the steadiest thing in the entire room. I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. Derek opened his mouth. Vera held up one hand. Owen was on his feet before anyone even saw him move. He came around the table fast, and for a moment, Cormarmac thought he was going to physically put himself between Derek and their father. Instead, he stopped 2 feet short and turned to face his brother. When he spoke, his voice had a rawness in it that Cormarmac recognized instantly. Do you know, Owen said, his jaw so tight, the words came out clipped, that I've been sending Mom and Dad $800 a month for 6 years. Derek stared at his brother. Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked, for just a second, like the very beginning of real understanding. Then Garrett put a hand on his shoulder, and the moment closed. Nora didn't stand. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out her phone, and opened the camera. She pointed it at Derek and Garrett and simply held it there without a word. Put that away, Derek said. Keep going, Nora said. Her voice was flat, her hand rock steady. He's on his way in, Dad. Dad? Hollis. At the end of the table, Garrett straightened. He'd made his recalculation. He stepped forward past Derek and faced the room with the bearing of a man resuming control of a situation that had briefly, uncomfortably, slipped away from him. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who'd been managing rooms for 30 years. I apologize for this interruption. This is a family matter, and it will be resolved privately. He looked at Cormarmac, his eyes gone flat and direct. He reached into his jacket and produced a pen. Cormarmac looked at the pen. Cormarmac put both hands flat on the table. I would like to read the rest of the document, he said, out loud to everyone here. Garrett's jaw tightened by a fraction. Cormarmac. The pen was still in the air. Garrett hadn't moved, and from somewhere near the back of the room, the ballroom door opened one more time, and Cormarmac heard the particular sound of leather soles on hardwood he'd known for 33 years. Hollis Vane had arrived. Garrett watched him cross the room. He recovered faster than Cormarmac expected. Cormarmac. The room held its breath. Then Nan Puit's chair scraped back. She'd been sitting at the VIP table near the front, quiet through everything, through Derek's words, through Owen standing up, through Nora's phone, through all of it. Garrett's head turned toward her. Nand. I heard what that boy said to his father, Nan said, not looking at her husband. Her voice was level and a little tired. Lacey's face went the color of the white tablet cloth. Garrett turned back to Cormarmac. The warmth in his voice was gone. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was something colder and more businesslike. Cormarmac picked up the pen. Cormarmac held the pen over the signature line. Then he set the pen down. Not signing. Just setting it down, flat on the table, parallel to the document. He looked up at Garrett. I want to hear from my attorney first, he said. Garrett's expression didn't break, but something behind it did. Hollis stepped forward from where he'd been standing. He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't necessary. Before any document is executed tonight, Hollis said, I want to clarify the legal status of what is in front of Mr. Strand. He opened his briefcase and set a single sheet of paper on the table beside the transfer agreement. Under Colorado law, a transfer of ownership in an LSE requires, at minimum, notarization of the signing party's signature, independent legal counsel for the transferring party, and full disclosure of the company's current valuation. He looked at the document on the table. Additionally, he continued, his voice the same throughout, calm, precise, unhurried, it is being presented to Mr. Strand in a public setting, under evident family and social pressure, following a direct verbal attack on his character. He looked at Garrett. That set of circumstances constitutes duress under Colorado statute. A document signed under duress is voidable at any time by the signing party. It protects no one. The room was absolutely still. Furthermore, Hollis said, I have reviewed the document itself. The transfer language is constructed to convey not merely management authority, but full ownership rights. $94 million. The number went into the room the way a stone goes into still water. Garrett's voice came out lower than before, stripped entirely of warmth. This is a private family matter. I represent Strand Mountain Holdings, LC, Hollis said. Mayor Patricia Dunn, at the VIP table, had set down her water glass. Marcus Webb's pen hadn't moved in 2 full minutes. Cormarmac, he said. Just the name, nothing after it. Let him finish, Cormarmac said. Hollis didn't rush. He'd been a lawyer for 33 years, and he understood that the value of information isn't only in the content, but in the delivery, in the space you give it to land, in the silence you let follow it, so the room has time to actually process what it's just heard. Cold Water Ridge Lodge, he said, was established on land acquired by August Clement Strand in 1974. The property was developed over the following 29 years by August Strand and his son, Cormarmac James Strand, working in partnership. He set a page on the table beside the transfer agreement, face up, the probate stamp clearly visible from several feet away. In 2006, Cormarmac Strand formally incorporated Strand Mountain Holdings, LC as the operating entity for the property. He has been the sole owner and managing member since the date of incorporation. The sentence landed. Cormarmac watched it hit Derek, not the way news hits when you hear it and understand it all at once, but the way something hits when you hear it and your mind refuses it the first time, and you have to hear it again inside your own head before it can finally become real. You work for my father, he said. His voice came out stripped of everything. The certainty, the performance, the volume, just the words, flat and bewildered. You have been working for my father this whole time. Garrett said nothing. The pen was still on the table in front of Cormarmac. From somewhere in the middle of the room, a man stood up. Cormarmac recognized him, the representative from Meridian Property Group in Denver, the man Garrett had invited to witness what he'd planned to be a full transfer of ownership. He'd driven 4 hours from Denver for this evening. He'd signed a preliminary letter of intent with Garrett 6 weeks earlier. He looked at Cormarmac across the room with the expression of a man who's just understood that every single assumption he walked in with was wrong. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice carried in the quiet. Did you say Strand Mountain Holdings? As in, Cormarmac Strand is the principal? He is, Hollis said. The man from Denver sat back down slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out his phone, looked at it, and put it away again. He looked at Garrett. I tried to acquire Strand Mountain Holdings in 2021, he said, mostly to himself, though the room was quiet enough that everyone heard it anyway. Marcus Webb's pen was moving again, fast and steady, filling his notebook with the kind of notes that meant a story had just changed shape entirely, right in front of him. Derek turned toward his father-in-law. His voice, when it came, was so stripped of everything it barely sounded like him at all. Garrett. He stopped, swallowed. Tell me you didn't know. Tell me you didn't walk into my parents' house at Thanksgiving and sit across from my father and ask him 3 questions about the resort and know the whole time that he stopped again. His hand came up and pressed flat against his own chest, hard, like a man checking that something was still there. Garrett looked at Derek for a long moment. He did not tell him that. The silence that followed wasn't empty. Lacey's hand went to his arm. He didn't seem to feel it. Cormarmac looked at his son across the table. The general manager was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time all evening, he looked like someone Cormarmac recognized. Hollis set one more page on the table. He didn't make a speech about it. He simply placed it face up where the light could reach it and said quietly, "Whenever you're ready, Cormarmac." Cormarmac looked at the page. Then he looked around the room, at Frank Odell at his table in the back, at Mayor Dunn, hands flat, eyes wide open, at Marcus Webb still writing, at Owen, standing, his hands finally still at his sides. He stood up. He'd been sitting at that table for nearly 2 hours. He stood the way he stands up from every chair, slowly, without any drama, the way a man stands when his knees have 68 years in them, and he's long since learned that most things worth doing don't require an entrance. He straightened his jacket, put both hands in his pockets, looked at Hollis and gave him a nod that meant go ahead and finish. Hollis turned one more page in his folder. Mr. Garrett Puit, in his capacity as general manager of Coldwater Ridge Lodge, entered into preliminary negotiations with Meridian Property Group of Denver, Colorado, with the stated intention of facilitating the sale of this property. The man from Meridian, still seated at his table in the middle of the room, rubbed a hand across his mouth and stared down at the tablecloth. Under Colorado law, Hollis continued, a general manager acting outside the scope of his contractual authority to the financial detriment of his employer constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. The letter of intent with Meridian, combined with the transfer agreement presented to Mr. Strand tonight, constitutes a pattern of conduct that exposes Mr. Puit to significant civil liability, including but not limited to damages for tortious interference with business relations and breach of the duty of loyalty. He looked at Garrett for the first time since walking into the room. I will be filing the relevant paperwork with the Colorado courts on Monday morning. Garrett's hand, resting on the back of Derek's chair, went very still. Derek was looking at his father-in-law with an expression Cormarmac had never before seen on his son's face. Not anger. His chest rose and fell once, hard. "You used me," Derek said. His voice was very quiet. Quiet the way things go quiet right before they finally break. Garrett looked at his son-in-law for a moment. Just a moment. Something moved across his face that might, in another life, have become the beginning of an explanation. Then it was gone, replaced by the controlled expression of a man who has spent his entire career learning exactly when a room has turned against him, and understanding that the only strategy left is silence. He said nothing. Lassie's hand came off Derek's arm. She took a step back, and then another, until she was standing alone at the edge of the table with her champagne glass and the particular look of a woman rapidly calculating which way the ground beneath her was about to tilt. Cormarmac had been watching his son. Now he watched Derek reach up and touch his own face, fingertips against his jaw. Then Frank Odell stood up at the back of the room. Frank wasn't a man who made speeches. In 22 years, Cormarmac had heard him string together more than 4 sentences at once, maybe a dozen times total. He stood, and the people at the surrounding tables turned to look at him, and he looked out at the room, and then at Cormarmac, and said what he'd come there to say. He looked around the room. "I just thought people in this room ought to know what kind of man they're talking about." He sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, with a different quality to it than it had held all evening. "August Strand broke the first ground on this property with that shovel in 1974, Hollis said. Cormarmac Strand has used it every winter since his father died. This morning, before driving here tonight, he used it to clear the front walk of this building." He looked at the room. "I thought that was worth knowing." Mayor Dunn's hand went to her mouth. Marcus Webb had stopped writing. He was looking at the photograph. Cormarmac looked at it too. His father in the snow, young and certain, holding the thing that had built everything he was now standing inside of. His throat tightened in a way he hadn't expected, and he pressed his lips together and waited for it to pass. Then he looked at Derek. He was looking at the photograph, eyes bright and red-rimmed in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne, hand pressed flat against his sternum again. Cormarmac watched his son look at his own grandfather in the snow, holding a shovel, and understand, for the very first time, all at once, the full weight of what he had just tried to sign away. His lips moved. No sound came out. "Dad," he said finally, just the word, nothing after it. Cormarmac looked at his son for a long moment. The man of 40, standing where the boy of 8 used to stand, hand pressed to his chest, eyes spilling over, every trace of the general manager gone completely from his face. He picked up the transfer agreement from the table, held it up so the room could see it. "This document," he said, "was prepared without my knowledge, and presented to me under conditions that render it legally unenforceable. My attorney has confirmed this. It will not be signed tonight or any other night." He looked at Garrett. "Your employment with Strand Mountain Holdings is terminated." Garrett picked up his leather folder from the table and tucked it under his arm. He looked at Cormarmac one last time, with the eyes of a man who has played a long game and lost it on the very final move. Then he turned and walked toward the ballroom door without another word. The room watched him go. The door had not fully closed behind Garrett when the sound started. It began as a low tone from the main speakers, the kind of sound a system makes warming up, when audio is being fed back through the line from a recording. The ballroom filled with Derek's voice. Not Derek's voice as it was now, but the stripped-down, red-rimmed voice from 90 minutes earlier, when he'd been standing over his father with a finger on a signature line and his performance at full volume. "Sign it, Dad. You've been a burden long enough. We're grown. We don't need a maintenance man following us around." A pause in the recording. Then, sign it. You're nothing but a parasite. You always have been. Under Colorado's one-party consent law, any party to a conversation may legally record it without the knowledge of the other parties involved. Cormarmac had been a party to every single conversation that took place in that room that night. Frank had made certain the system was running before the first guest arrived. Eddie, at the soundboard, sat very still with his hands folded in his lap. Derek had not moved since the playback started. He stood at the edge of the table where he'd been standing when it ended, Hans still pressed to his chest, face still wet, mouth slightly open the way a mouth goes when the body can't decide what expression is appropriate for what the mind is still processing. Lacey took another step back. Owen sat down, his hands flat on the table, his head bowed, his jaw working the way a jaw works when a man is trying very hard not to cry in a room full of people and not entirely succeeding. Nora lowered her phone. She looked at her brother for a long moment, not with the expression of someone who has won something, but with the expression of someone who has watched the exact thing she feared most finally happen. Paige made a sound halfway between a breath and a sob. Mayor Patricia Dunn sat with both hands flat on the table, her eyes moving between Derek and Cormarmac, the expression of a woman assembling something piece by piece in real time that she suspected was going to stay assembled for a very long while. Cormarmac stood up from his chair. He'd been seated most of the evening. He stood slowly, the way he always stands, and looked around the room. The performance was gone. Cormarmac had said more words that night than he planned to say in an entire year. He only needed one more. He walked around the table, past Hollis, who stepped back to give him room, past the folded transfer agreement lying on the tablecloth, past the photograph of August in the snow. He stopped when he was close enough that Derek could hear him without needing to raise his voice at all. He didn't raise it. "I built this place so you would have somewhere to stand," he said. "Not somewhere to stand above me." He held his son's gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and took Vera's hand, where she'd already risen from her chair to meet him, and together they walked toward the ballroom door. Behind them, Cormarmac heard Owen push back his chair. It was slow at first, deliberate, the way Frank did everything. Then another pair of hands joined it. Then another. By the time Cormarmac and Vera reached the door, the sound had grown into something he didn't turn around to look at, because he didn't need to see it. He could feel it moving through the floor beneath his feet, through the walls of the building his father had started and he had finished, through 68 years of mornings that had all started before dawn, with cold air and a worn wooden handle, and the particular satisfaction of work that asks nothing of you except that you show up and do it right. He held the door for his wife. They walked out into the Telluride night together, cold, clear, and very still. The mountains invisible in the dark, but there, the way certain things are always there, whether or not you can actually see them. He slept that night. That was the first thing, the thing he hadn't managed to do properly in months. He lay down beside Vera at 11:30 and was gone before midnight. A clean, dreamless sleep, the way sleep comes when a body has finally set something heavy down. He was up before 6 the next morning. Old habit. He started at the top of the front walk and worked down toward the road. Push and lift and redirect. At 8, Hollis sent the formal termination letter to Garrett Puit. Breach of fiduciary duty and conflict of interest, effective immediately, company property to be returned within 48 hours. A second letter went to Garrett's attorney, outlining the civil action related to the Meridian letter of intent. Cormarmac never read whatever response Garrett may have sent back. Hollis handled it. That was, after all, exactly what Hollis was for. Derek called at 9:15, then 9:40, then twice more before 11. At 10:45, Vera called. "He sounds like himself," she said. "The version from before." Cormarmac stood in the middle of the east path, shovel handle in both hands, cold on his face. "I know," she said. "I told him you were working." That evening, the 5 of them sat together in the kitchen until well past midnight. "Why didn't you tell us?" Owen finally asked. He wasn't angry anymore, just asking. Not about the money, just, "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" "I thought I was protecting you," Cormarmac said, "from what knowing changes in a person." "And now?" Nora asked. He picked up his spoon. "Now I think August was smarter than me." Owen made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Yeah," he said. On Monday, Marcus Webb's story ran on the front page of the Telluride Daily Planet. The photograph he'd taken at 6 that morning, one Cormarmac hadn't even known was being taken, showed him from behind. Cormarmac read it once at the kitchen table over coffee, folded it. Put it in the drawer where he kept the things worth keeping. 3 months later, he had August's shovel mounted on the wall of the resort's main office, the room he'd spent 21 years avoiding calling his own. Brass brackets, centered exactly where the morning light hit first. No plaque, no explanation needed. Frank saw it the day he put it up and simply nodded once. That was enough. The civil case against Garrett settled that March. Cormarmac didn't attend. Hollis handled it. The Meridian deal had died the very night of the party. The Denver representative withdrew his letter of intent within 48 hours, citing concerns about the counterparty's actual authority to represent the asset. Cormarmac didn't need to hear more than that. 5 months after the party, on a Thursday afternoon in April, his phone rang while he was sitting in the truck in the resort parking lot, engine running, about to drive home. Derek. He let it ring twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, he picked it up. Dad. His son's voice was careful and quiet, stripped down to something Cormarmac hadn't heard from him in 4 years. I don't know how to start this. Start anywhere, Cormarmac said. A long pause. Outside the windshield, the mountains were showing the first thin green along the tree line, the color that means winter is finally, genuinely letting go. Can I come up? Derek said. Not to talk about the resort, not about any of it. I want to help with whatever you're working on, if that's okay. Cormarmac looked out at the mountains for a moment. There's a fence line on the north perimeter, he said. 2 posts need resetting before the ground thaws all the way. It's cold work. I know. You'll need gloves, Cormarmac said. The real kind, not the dress kind. A sound came through the phone. Something between a breath and a word. Something that had clearly been waiting a long time to get out. I know, Dad, Derek said. I know. Cormarmac kept August's shovel on the wall of his office for a reason, not as a trophy. If you're holding something back from the people you love, telling yourself it protects them, hear this part clearly. It doesn't always protect them. Sometimes it just leaves them standing in the dark with no map, making decisions they would never make if they could actually see the full picture. Say the true thing before someone else finds a way to use your silence against you. Every version of this kind of story you've ever been drawn to is really about the same thing underneath. Someone who finally refused to stay invisible. Someone whose family mistook decades of quiet strength for something smaller than it actually was. And nearly every one of these stories, in real life, traces back to the exact same starting point. One person who simply stayed silent for too long, about something the people who love them deserve to know. If this one stayed with you, drop a comment and let me know. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. A last, honest note before you go. Some of what you just heard includes fictional elements, woven together to explore something true about real families and real silence. If that's not the kind of content you're here for, no hard feelings at all. Go find what does speak to you. But if you're still here with me, I'll see you in the next one.